I have been meaning to make this video for a long time, and now I finally brought myself to do it. The main reason being the person who got me into this band, not saying any names, turned out to be a big poser, which is just great. So I decided to make my own video from someone who actually likes this band. Now I have said in the past that my favorite band was Iron Maiden, then Judas Priest at another point. Turns out I was lying. My favorite band is actually Virgin Steele. I know most of you watching have probably not heard of this band, and you're probably wondering what kind of name is Virgin Steele. Now let me put a disclaimer here. This band is very weird, and there is a lot of information about the band which makes me embarrassed to be a fan of this band. But ignoring all of that, Virgin Steele makes very good music. They are basically a US power metal band, in the same vein as bands like Sabotage, Manowar, Crimson Glory, Liege Lord, Iced Earth and so many more. US power metal is my favorite genre in all of metal, not cheesy European power metal, that's a whole different thing. US power metal is a lot heavier and is way more riff focused, and Virgin Steele is the best example of US power metal. They have some of the most hard-hitting riffs, and the best melodies you will ever hear. I'm not over-exaggerating. If you want what the perfect metal band is, it's Virgin Steele, alright. Now this video is not going to be ranking their albums like I would usually do. Instead, this is going to be structured like a retrospective, where I would go through the band's discography in order of release date, and talk more about the history of the band. But at the end of the video I will show you guys how I would rank their albums, so let's dive right in. I won't go too deep into their history and I'll try to be as brief as possible so this video would be easier to watch. So basically, Virgin Steele was formed in 1981 in New York by founding guitarist Jack Starr. Even though he started the band, he doesn't stick around for very long. He recruited members like drummer Joey Avazian, bassist Kelly Nichols, who would play in LA Guns later on in the 80s. He didn't stick around in the band for that long and was replaced by Joe O'Reilly, and finally, to fit the missing piece, vocalist and keyboardist David Defeis, who is the most important person in the band. He is basically their main songwriter, and is a very good vocalist and keyboard player. He would be the driving force and leader of the band, and with this newly formed lineup came their first album. These first two Virgin Steele albums are very different from the rest of their catalog. This is mainly because David Defeis contributed the least in songwriting than any other Virgin Steele album. The songs were written mostly by Jack Starr, who was leading the band during this time. Jack Starr and David Defeis were both very inspired by 70s hard rock. Those influences blended into their first album right here, with little elements of neoclassical. Jack Starr's songwriting approach was a lot more hard rocking and riff focused, while David Defeis' approach was more classical inspired. His songwriting approach is really where Virgin Steele gets their sound and identity. Pretty much all of their albums are a perfect blend between heavy metal and classical music. It's not like in Y. Malmsteen where he shreds a Bach solo piece throughout the whole song. It's more like a orchestra symphony approach, where the song as a whole, including chord progressions and section changes, is written like an orchestra symphony. This is what makes Virgin Steele unique from every other band. David Defeis is literally a classical composer writing heavy metal songs. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, as we should dive into this album right here. This album is basically a 70s hard rock album, but it has a ton of moments where Jack Starr just shreds. For example, the song Pulverizer is basically Jack Starr showing he can be as good as Eddie Van Halen with his Eruption spin-off, and he is pretty close. But like I've said before, most songs on this album are 70s hard rock, Deep Purple and Rainbow Worship. My favorites would include Drive On Through, Pictures of You, and my favorite from those songs would be the very catchy ballad, and one of the songs co-written by David Defeis, Still in Love with You. This song would set the foundation of Virgin Steele's more melodic material in the future, as we start to see David Defeis' extraordinary melody composing skills. But there are two songs on this album that shows what Virgin Steele would later become in the future, those being the heavy power metal anthems. One of them is the opening track Danger Zone, and my favorite song on this album, Children of the Storm. Cool little bit about the song. This song was so good that Virgin Steele got fan mail from Metallica and Queensryche, telling them how much they appreciated Children of the Storm. This goes to show Virgin Steele were the real deal. Overall, despite it not being power metal for the most part, I think this is a very good debut album for Virgin Steele, its only flaws being the lackluster production, and David Defeis' voice not fully polished yet, but in a short amount of time David Defeis would become one of the greatest singers in heavy metal. Let's move on to their second album. Even though Guardians of the Flame is part of the Jack Star-led era of Virgin Steele, this album is a bigger step to what the band would eventually sound like. David Defeis writes a lot more, and instead of co-writing with Jack Star for all of the tracks on the first album, this is the first time we see songs that were fully written by David Defeis. The songs that were written by him almost sound like the classic Virgin Steele sound. For example, in the opening song Don't Say Goodbye Tonight, the song is driven by chord progressions and melody instead of rhythm and heavy riffage. The song feels very original, even if you think it sounds like Iron Maiden or Judas Priest. That's actually wrong. This style of classical fusion with heavy metal was very original during this time, and this sound is what the style of Virgin Steele would become from this album onwards. Now the other songs on this album are a lot more heavier and metal-based than the first album, but still has elements of Deep Purple and Rainbow. Jack Star writes the heavier songs from the album, including tracks like Metal City and especially Burn the Sun. But what really makes this album incredible are the two back-to-back epic tracks. There is Guardians of the Flame, which sounds a lot like traditional metal, but it has some very anthemic melodies. My favorite song on this album would be the other epic, The Redeemer. I would describe this song as a much heavier version of Stargazer from Rainbow. It's very mid-tempo and the song has a very cool progression and build-up. Guardians of the Flame is the album you should start with when getting into Virgin Steele, as it shows the band already finding their sound. big epic melodies and awesome riffs. The album is kind of weaker in their discography, mainly because of the same issues as the first album, underproduced production, and David Defeis' voice is still not near its true form. But this album is still amazing. Don't ignore this Jack Starr era of the band. Now before we move on to their third album, we have to talk about the EP they've released later that year. I won't spend that much time on this EP because it's not that important in the Virgin Steele discography, but it does have some noteworthy songs to check out. The EP is only 4 songs. 3 of them are original songs they've recorded around this time. The songs are really good, but I won't say they are as good as songs from Guardians of the Flame, but there is one song I really like, which is Go Down Fighting. Unfortunately, this Jack Starr lineup did not last. Jack Starr was out of Virgin Steele. Now the backstory behind this is still skeptical of being true, but after watching some interviews I have a pretty good idea in what happened. If I was wrong in any of this information, please feel free to let me know. So basically, Jack Starr hired this manager to try and improve the band, but apparently he was trying to break up the band by putting thoughts and ideas into David Defeis' head. I don't know exactly what those were, but I assume he was trying to convince him that he didn't need Jack Starr. Jack Starr also recorded a solo album around this time, so it would make sense that he was losing interest in Virgin Steele, but Jack Starr himself said he wanted to stay in the band.
I went and recorded a solo album called Out of the Darkness in 1984. I had the intention of coming back.
Also, I think another factor to cause Jack Starr to leave was him and David Defeis' musical differences. If you look at the writing credits on Guardians of the Flame, the songs that David wrote compared to the ones Jack Starr wrote feel very different from one another. I've said before that Jack Starr preferred a hard and heavy approach, while David Defeis was more focused on classical compositions and melody writing. With that factor combined with Jack's solo project and the manager trying to split them up, Jack Starr just happened to leave the band. Since he was the founding member, he sold the rights to the band. Even though this was all very unfortunate, the next lineup will certainly make up for it. Jack Starr was replaced by Edward Persino, who was an old friend of David Defeis. His playing I find to be pretty similar to Jack Starr's, but the difference is that his writing approach fits very well with David's compositions, and from this point onwards David Defeis will write every single song for Virgin Steele. We finally have the ultimate Virgin Steele lineup and my personal favorite one, and soon enough put out a very kick-ass album. Here we go. Virgin Steele has reached its true form. David Defeis is now in charge, and he will write some of the best heavy metal material you will ever hear. Noble Savage is a killer, and I mean killer album. This is where classical music meets epic power metal. The songs are so epic and powerful. Every member is at their top game. David Defeis' vocals have suddenly transformed from the soft high falsetto range he used in the first 2 albums, to rough, powerful screaming and shouting, kind of like Eric Adams, except with a lot more balls and steel. That vocal style makes David Defeis one of my favorite vocalists in heavy metal. Edward Persino also does some amazing guitar work, particularly in his solos, which I'm not sure if it's him or David Defeis that writes them, but he plays some of the most catchy and melodic solos ever. Even though David Defeis writes every song, there are some tracks that have writing contributions from Edward Persino. Those songs usually have the band's best riffs, as he is the one who contributes with writing riffs. The songs without his contributions aren't very riff-based, and focus a lot more on chord progressions and melody. Anyways, Joey Abazian does a great drumming performance on this album, and you can hear some very badass bass lines from Joe O'Reilly, as the production of this album has the bass volume pretty loud. Every song on this album, except for Rock Me, which is kind of a filler, is so good. You can really hear the band's shift to epic power metal with one of my favorite tracks, Thy Kingdom Come. It's short, but so punchy, epic, and anthemic. Even though this was the first true Virgin Steele album, not every song is power metal. You get some tracks that sound a lot like hair metal, kind of like some songs from the first two albums, such as Don't Close Your Eyes, which is a really good ballad, Rock Me, and The Evil in Her Eyes, which is very catchy. It's like if Motley Crue was power metal. But like I've said before, this album shines on its epic power metal tracks, such as Thy Kingdom Come, the catchy anthemic opener We Rule the Night, and just like the last album, there are two long epic songs that are over 7 minutes, one of them being the closing track The Angel of Light, which has a lot of classical style compositions in it. The best song on this album is hands down the other epic, Noble Savage, one of their catchiest and anthemic songs they've ever wrote and a certified classic song of theirs. Noble Savage is an absolute apex in the heavy metal and power metal genre, and was the start of the true sound of Virgin Steele. Now, before we move on to their next album, we have to talk about some side projects the band was involved in right after Noble Savage. There are 3 albums I want to talk briefly about. Some of them contain the full Virgin Steele lineup and some having only a few members. But what all 3 of these albums have in common is that they are all written by David Defeis. The first one is Nightmare Theater by Exorcist. Some of you might have heard of this album before, and were skeptical of who this band actually was. This band was in fact the entire full lineup of Virgin Steele. What really makes this album confusing is that Virgin Steele hid their identities for this band, creating fake names as the lineup for Exorcist. I don't know exactly why they did this, but I'm thinking it's because of how different this album is from every other Virgin Steele album. Nightmare Theater is primarily a speed metal album, but with a tinge of first-wave black metal, kinda like Bathory and Venom. This is mainly due to David Defeis vocals. He uses death growls on this album, which sounds nothing like what he usually sounds like. To this day I cannot believe that is him singing. But you can still tell that this band is Virgin Steele by the guitar playing. The riffs and solos definitely sound like something Edward Persina would play, but those vocals, my god, I cannot believe that's David Defeis. The next album is Piledriver's Stay Ugly. Now this time this isn't Virgin Steele pretending to be another band. Piledriver is a Canadian speed metal band with its own lineup, but Virgin Steele was involved with their second album Stay Ugly. Edward Persino plays guitar on the album, and the songs were written by David Defeis and Edward Persino, so musically you can call this a Virgin Steele album, but this is a different band. And the last album with contributions from Virgin Steele is Original Sin Sin Will Find You Out. Just like Exorcist's Nightmare Theater, this album is also Virgin Steele in disguise, but almost. This album, believe it or not, has David Defeis' sister on vocals, David Defeis, who is one of, if not my favorite female vocalist in heavy metal. This album also has Mark Edwards on drums instead of Joey Evasion. Just like the other two albums, this one is also speed metal, and is probably my favorite metal album with a female vocalist. These three albums are all onslaughts on speed metal and are some of the best albums in that genre, mainly due to David Defeis' songwriting skills on all three of these albums. I highly recommend you check these albums out if you are a fan of Virgin Steele. Now that's out of the way, let's move on to the last 80s album for Virgin Steele.
Ride on the wings of the night. You know you want to ride on the wings of the night. You're old enough to ride on the wings of the night. I'm coming for you.
Virgin Steele will keep getting better and better from here on out. These next sling of albums are absolutely phenomenal and are some of my favorite heavy metal records ever. These albums are what really makes me love this band and showcases their musical genius. Age of Consent is such an amazing album. It's definitely the best one from the 80s era and is nearly a perfect album. It's a very unique album for Virgin Steele and a standout record in general, because at the time David Defeis was really starting to get into the more melodic side of rock music, particularly hair metal and AOR. What really makes Age of Consent very cool and unique is that it combines the classic epic power metal stuff Virgin Steele are known for, with tinges of AOR. This album is flavored with elements of Europe and Dokken. AOR is a guilty pleasure genre of music for me and is the reason I love Age of Consent so much. Already in the first song, On the Wings of the Night, which you've already heard in the opening segment for this album, showcases a perfect blend between power metal and AOR melodies, and that's basically what you get for this whole album. Sure, there are heavier, more power metal driven tracks and more softer and mellow tunes, but this album is primarily power metal mixed with AOR. I love almost every song and this album's consistency is mind-blowing. That's gonna be a recurring pattern for these next slew of Virgin Steele albums. There are a few songs that are just straight up hard rock. There's Stay on Top, which is a Uriah Heep cover, Tragedy, which has a very nice melody, and my favorite from these songs, the interesting closure, We Are Eternal, which is very atmospheric and keyboard driven, and I absolutely love it, especially the solo. There is also a ballad on this album, and let me just say, Virgin Steele are the absolute best at writing ballads. They write better ballads than even Guns N' Roses. All of their ballads are very beautiful and emotional, especially with the ballad on Age of Consent, Cry Forever. This song really captures the beauty of David Defeis' melody writing skills. my favorite songs off here are the more power metal driven ones, like On the Wings of the Night, Lion in Winter, and especially Chains of Fire. What a compelling melodic powerhouse. But the best song on this album is an all-time classic for the band. It's by far their most popular song, and is a good chance it has introduced you to this band. I'm talking about the Burning of Rome Cry for Pompeii. This song summarizes the band perfectly. Hard, powerful, crushing riffs and outstanding melodies. This song is an absolute must-listen for this band.
One nation, one kingdom, one shall survive. One nation, one kingdom, one shall survive. I'll meet you again through the eyes of our sun. Remember, sailing on the prize we had to pay. And cry for Pompeii.
Age of Consent is so good. It's really the only album that mixes power metal with AOR melodies. You will absolutely love this album if you like Europe and Dokken. Now sadly, after this album was released, it barely got any promotion and financial success. Virgin Steele were in a hectic financial situation and decided to disband for 5 years. They would reunite and release their 5th album in 1993 with a new bassist, Rob DiMartino, and would return with a bang, but in a way you wouldn't expect. Finally, here we are. We have reached the 90s era of Virgin Steele, which is their classic era. This is where they turned into a full-on power metal band, and these next run of albums are some of my favorite records in heavy metal. It's absolutely insane the role these guys went on, especially David Defeis, who probably spent hours and hours on end writing material for these albums, but out of these albums there is one elephant in the room, which is Life Among the Ruins. Even though I consider this album part of the classic era, it's not power metal at all. It's actually entirely hard rock. It sounds very similar to the self-titled album from Whitesnake, with a little more pop and melody to it. Even the first song on the album, Sex Religion Machine, which you heard in the beginning of this segment, sounds a lot like Crying in the Rain from Whitesnake. So even though this album was definitely commercial and not power metal at all, I still absolutely love this album. In fact, it is my favorite hard rock record of all time. I'm not exaggerating. Virgin Steele have managed to write some of the best rock material I have ever heard, mainly because of David Defeis composing. He is a master at writing melodies, which is at full force on this album, and also his voice is at his absolute peak on here. His voice gradually got better throughout the 80s, but on Life Among the Ruins his voice is so powerful, beautiful, and polished, and is probably my favorite vocal performance of all time. Now every single song is full of catchy riffs and hooks. I would say the catchiest riff on the album is on Love's Gone, a song which has incredible vocals and insane guitar playing throughout. Another song that is very cool is Crown of Thorns, which I guess you can say is the epic off this album, clocking in at 6 minutes. It also has a very catchy riff and hook to it, but it has a progressive tendency to it which I love. Another part that makes Life Among the Ruins really special to me are the ballads. Some of the band's best ballads are on this album, which are Never Believed in Goodbye, Wildfire Woman. Both are very catchy and melodic, but my favorite one is a guilty pleasure of mine, which is Last Rose of Summer. This song is only keyboards, acoustic guitar and vocals, and on your first listen it may sound pretty cheesy, but once it grows on you, it's one of the most beautiful and emotional songs ever. This song gives me chills every single time. My favorite songs on here are the more heavy rockers, like Love is Pain, Sex Religion Machine, I Dress in Black, and my favorite song is what I think is the catchiest, Jet Black. You can tell most of these songs were co-written by Edward Persino, as they all have very awesome riffs. This combined with David Defeis' melody composing skills is really what makes Virgin Steele special. This album is absolutely incredible. Every single song is perfect. Virgin Steele managed to perfect hard rock by adding their incredible composing styles to it. If you are a fan of hard rock, I would definitely listen to this album, and if you're more into the power metal side of this band, I recommend you give this a chance at least. Now, a year later, the band would entirely ditch this hard rock style and turn to a full-on power metal direction. Rob DiMartino would also leave the band, meaning Edward Persino would do the guitar and bass work. Now we move on to the absolute best era of the band, and my favorite albums of all time. We have made it, the classic power metal era of Virgin Steele. This era contains some of the best material in heavy metal. A lot of these records are some of my favorite albums ever, and starting off this era are actually my two favorite albums of all time, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell Parts 1 and 2. I know I have said before that Somewhere in Time was my favorite album of all time, but once I've heard The Marriage Saga, they managed to be even more special than Somewhere in Time. The level musically of these two albums is absolutely perfect, and is exactly what I'm looking for when I listen to music. These albums have the perfect melodies, the best riffs, and some of the best vocals you will ever hear. Now I'm gonna talk about part 1 first. This album, right now I'm struggling to put into words how much I love this album. This whole album contains some of the most badass power metal songs you will ever hear. What I really love about part 1 is that it has 14 songs, and all of them are incredible. I love long perfect albums that have a ton of shorter songs instead of a few longer ones. The consistency of this album is something else. Once you hear the first song, you'll be thinking, wow, that's one of the best power metal songs ever. Then you're in for a treat, because every other song on the album is just like that. All of these songs have the most badass riffs, the best vocal melodies, and the best songwriting. The songs that are co-written by Edward Persino are the more unique songs on the album, as they contain the best riffs from the album, especially with the Raven song, a song that has some crazy classical style compositions and some very wonky riffs. Some other really awesome power metal tracks would be, literally the rest of the album, like Really, It was so hard picking favorites because of how consistent this album is, but I really love songs like Weeping of the Spirits, Blood of the Saints, and especially Blood and Gasoline, which has the best and most catchy chord progressions and melodies. Just listen to this album already, goddammit. Even though most songs on this album are only like 4 and 5 minutes, there are some tracks that reach the 6-minute mark. I guess you can say they are the epics. There is Life Among the Ruins, Trail of Tears, which has one of Edward Persino's best solos in the band. And there's The Last Supper, which is a really heavy and dark track, and definitely a standout moment from this album. This album also has some ballads, and are in my opinion Virgin Steele's best ballads, and are some of my favorite ballads ever. There's Forever Will I Roam, and House of Dust. I cannot describe how good these ballads are, you have to listen to them yourself. The only way I describe them is that they are on the same level as Walk Away from Dokken, which is my favorite Dokken song. These ballads really show how great the melodies of Virgin Steele are. But if I had to pick a favorite song, it would have to be the opening track, I Will Come For You. This song is a melody powerhouse. The chorus is anthemic and epic, and what I really love about the song is the middle section. It's mainly just a guitar melody, but that melody is actually the theme to the Marriage of Heaven and Hell albums, as the theme plays throughout parts 1, 2, and Invictus, and it's so cool to listen to. This album is just such a masterpiece. Very few albums that have over 10 songs are masterpieces, and this one is one of the albums that makes Virgin Steele so special to me. This album is an absolute must-listen, containing some of the best and hard-hitting power metal you will ever hear. But now let's move on to part 2, which, believe it or not, I think is a tiny bit better than this one. The second part of the Marriage of Heaven and Hell saga is my favorite album of all time. This time I'm serious, and it's probably gonna stay like that for a long time. Now this album is slightly different from part 1. Instead of being focused more on the heavy hard-hitting power metal stuff, it's more focused on atmosphere, melody, and epicness. It's definitely still power metal, but it's a bit more soft and more focused on composition. To me, this album is the single best piece of music I've ever heard. All of the melodies, riffs, and compositions absolutely blow my mind. Now a little backstory on myself. I used to play the violin when I was a child for about 8 years. Then I switched to guitar when I discovered heavy metal music, but my musical background has always been based on classical music, and it gave me a really good understanding in how music is supposed to work. This album blends the elements of heavy metal and classical music in the best way possible, and for me personally this album is the epitome of what I envision to be musical perfection. Okay, I think that was the best way I could describe this album. If you're still not convinced, then listen to it already. Now, the drummer Joey Evasian only recorded half of this album, and then left the band for some unknown reason. He was replaced by Frank Gilchrist, who recorded the rest of this album. I think he was a slightly better drummer than Joey. Now, another thing I love about this album is the variety. The song lengths are more drastic than in part 1. The tempos between the tracks vary a lot more. Each song stands out more than they would in part 1, and the songs feel a lot more well composed. One song on this album that was very well composed is Crown of Glory, which is one of my favorite Virgin Steele songs. The progressions, the melodies, the section changes. This song is packed full of composer mastery, and sums up this band's songwriting style perfectly. Another song I find to be very cool is Unholy Water. What's interesting about this song is that it has a very heavy riff, but the song is very melodic and kind of feels like a ballad. There's not a lot of songs like these. Based off those two songs, aren't those some of the best melodies you've ever heard? If you think otherwise, then die by my sword, you mortal. There are a few really heavy power metal tracks on this album, including a Symphony of Steel, which is definitely Virgin Steele's fastest song. It's also kind of a ripoff of Man-O-War's Wheels of Fire, but Man-O-War barely reaches Virgin Steele's standards, so it's fine. There's also the epic closure Victory Is Mine, and I absolutely love Devil and Daughter, a song that has some crazy Edward Persino soloing and riffage, and some very catchy hooks. But there are two songs that really makes this album special to me, those being the back-to-back epics. The first one is this very dark and atmospheric 7-minute epic. It reminds me a lot of Achilles' Last Stand from Led Zeppelin. The whole song feels like a progression, and it has a ton of very cool sections. And the other epic, MLS. This is my personal favorite song of all time. This song has all of the best melodies David Defeis could write. It has the Marriage of Heaven and Hell theme, and many other melodies and themes that get played throughout their other albums. This song is Virgin Steele's Stairway to Heaven. It's an absolute masterpiece of a song with its brilliant composing. Just listen to it. This album is absolutely brilliant. It contains some of my favorite melodies ever, especially in MLS. This album is proof that David Defeis is probably the best songwriter to come out of metal. The way he blends classical and heavy metal music together is mind-blowing. Now, after this point, Virgin Steele would slightly change their sound again, but would remain power metal, just heavier, and this next album would showcase Virgin Steele at their heaviest, except for Exorcist's Nightmare Theater. Now we have reached Invictus. It is actually conceptually the third part of the Marriage of Heaven and Hell saga, but it sounds so different from those albums, so most people call it Invictus. This album is heavy, easily Virgin Steele's heaviest album. Now the most notable change is David Defeis' voice. From this point onwards, he doesn't really use his high range anymore. Instead he sings in a much more lower range, and uses a more rough and raspy vocal style. It actually took me a while to get into this album and the House of Atreus albums because of this, but once it grows on you, that vocal approach works really well with this heavier style. The production is more heavy, the riffs are heavier, and Frank Gilchrist's drumming was really awesome during this time. This is the beginning where we hear a lot of double bass drums in the songs, giving the songs a more powerful and heavy feeling. Now the glorious Virgin Steele melodies are definitely still here, even if they sound darker. Invictus is full of anthemic and dark melodies, and the heavier approach really works with Virgin Steele. David Defeis' composing is absolutely genius, as he can change his style of songwriting for different albums. He never really repeats himself. Now this album is full of killer power metal tracks, including one of my favorite tracks, Defiance, which is the only song on the album with writing contributions from Edward Persino. The only issue with Invictus is that there aren't enough Edward Persino songwriting credits, as he writes so many killer riffs, but this album is still very good, so I think it's fine. I forgot to mention that almost every song on this album is long. There are only 3 songs that are under 6 minutes, but because David Defeis is a master at composing, these songs are long for a reason, and don't waste any time at all. A great example being Dominion Day, another killer power metal song with very good melodies, and has a lot of middle sections to make the length 6 minutes. What a killer song this is. Another amazing song is the ending epic, Veni Vidi Vici, which is 11 minutes. It really feels like the grand finale of the album, being very uplifting and anthemic. It definitely stands out for not being dark unlike most of the other tracks. This song is epic for sure. Some other killer songs on this album are the title track, Sword of the Gods, and like every song on this album, but my favorite has to be the other epic on the album, clocking in at 9 minutes, A Whisper of Death. This is definitely the darkest song on the album, and it has so many amazing melodies and middle sections. This is one of their best epics and one of their best songs in general. Invictus is an absolutely killer masterpiece from Virgin Steele. I'd definitely listen to this if you want something heavier from Virgin Steele. I would say this is their ultimate power metal album, and the album that sounds the most like power metal. Now literally right after this album, David Defeis would write another 2-part series like The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, called The House of Atreus. Here we have another two-part series of albums, just like the Marriage of Heaven and Hell records, but the House of Atreus acts are pretty different from the Marriage albums. The House of Atreus is actually a concept album, while the Marriage albums were kind of a loose concept. The House of Atreus concept revolves around Greek mythology, and it has a subtitle name of, get this, a barbaric romantic opera. Now David Defeis actually calls his music barbaric romanticism. This is where Virgin Steele gets pretty stupid and cheesy for me. What is that supposed to mean? But anyways, the House of Atreus albums are absolutely killer. It continues that heavy direction from Invictus, but with more classical and medieval elements. You can really picture yourself in a Trojan battle with this music. The first act is very good. Now what makes the House of Atreus albums different from the rest of Virgin Steele's catalog are the interlude tracks. There are a ton of interludes between the songs. They are mostly 1 to 2 minutes long, and are mainly guitar and vocal passages, and some piano playing. These interludes nearly make up half the runtime of these albums. This would usually be a bad thing, but I don't think the interludes ruin these albums, mainly because they are really good. They add more atmosphere and theme to these albums, and also set the mood for the tracks that come after it. Now the first act is full of absolutely killer power metal tracks. One song I really love is The Fire God. Now I forgot to mention while I was talking about the Virgin Steele side projects after Noble Savage, they actually re-recorded some songs from Piledriver's Stay Ugly and Exorcist's Nightmare Theater, and put them on the House of Atreus albums. The Fire God is a re-recording of a song from Stay Ugly, and man, this version absolutely rips, definitely better than the original. Another song that absolutely slays is Through the Ring of Fire, one of their heaviest and most badass songs ever. Some other killer songs on this album would include Agony and Shame, Great Sword of Flame, the beautiful ballad Child of Desolation, the epic opener Kingdom of the Fearless, but my favorite song has to be Flames of the Black Star, a song that I feel was the most well composed off this first act. It's heavy, anthemic, and has a good share of middle sections, one of their best songs. Overall, the House of Atreus Act 1 is an absolutely killer power metal record, and yet another masterpiece from Virgin Steele. I told you the run these guys went on is absolutely insane. Now let's move on to Act 2. Act 2 is pretty much the same style as Act 1, definitely the same quality of music, but I would say I slightly prefer Act 2 over Act 1, the main difference between the two being the track listing. Now with Act 1 all of the interlude songs were scattered out throughout the record, but for Act 2 most of the interludes are in the second half of the album, which are actually combined into suites. That's one thing I prefer about Act 2 over Act 1, it's more organized and has most of the best songs in the first half. The other thing that makes me like Act 2 a little bit more is that there are more standout moments. There are a handful of songs that I would consider to be some of Virgin Steele's best songs, and the way they are arranged in the track listing is perfect. One song I really love is a re-recorded Exorcist song, called Fire of Ecstasy, which in Nightmare Theater is named Call for the Exorcist, and just like the Fire God I prefer Fire of Ecstasy over the Exorcist version, mainly because they also re-wrote the song adding more sections, one of their best songs. Another killer song I love would be Flames of Thy Power, a very classical inspired track with awesome melodies.
Flames of thy power, to rise with the bound. Flames of thy power, I worship the sun. No one remembers standing proud.
There is also a very good ballad, called When the Legends Die, which is one of Virgin Steele's best ballads. It's pretty dark and heavy for a ballad, but it's still really good.
Troy is burning, say farewell, like the fire of 1,000 days. Rain and slaughter, even gods can lie.
Some other awesome songs on this album would include Wings of Vengeance, Arms of Mercury, The Wine of Violence, and my favorite song has to be one of the epics off this album, A Token of My Hatred, one of the best long epic songs ever. The songwriting is absolutely brilliant, there's a really long Edward Persino solo, and the melodies are brilliant, a top 10 Virgin Steele song for sure.
Like the wind, sway through the air. See the cauldron of blood burning there. From the dark side, let the child arrive. The light that brings up the sky. On the day when all time.
And there goes another perfect masterpiece from this band. The House of Atreus act is definitely a must-listen from Virgin Steele and contains some of their heaviest, powerful, and adventurous music. These are essential power metal albums to me. Now sadly, we have reached the end of the classic era of Virgin Steele. We had 6 masterpieces in a row, but that had to end at some point. Now we reach the decline of this band. Even though they are my favorite band this modern era, I do take much issue with, but before we dive into that, we have to talk about a compilation album first.
Evil walks the night. Terror kills the light. I confuse the world. Like a plague upon the world.
The Book of Burning is a compilation album full of rare recordings from Virgin Steele's first 2 albums. So why am I talking about this? Well, this album has quite a bit of new material I thought I should mention, mainly because they were part of a David Defeis and Jack Starr reunion project in 1997. At that time they wrote together and recorded demos for these songs, but they were re-recorded in the Book of Burning with Virgin Steele's lineup. Now there are 4 songs, and honestly I find them to be kind of lackluster, except for one song, Rain of Fire, which kicks absolute ass.
Fire, wash away my pain, wash away my fate, the rise of born again. Rain of fire, like one from the sky. I'm the Lord of lies, on the wings of hate I ride. Rain of fire.
But moving on, Virgin Steele went on a hiatus from recording new studio material for about 4 years. During that time they were mostly touring and doing whatever else was going on in their lives. Because of all of this touring they had to get a new bass player as they still didn't have one. So they got a bass player named Josh Block who would stay with the band to this day. Then finally, in 2006, they released Visions of Eden, and now we are witnessing the sad decline of Virgin Steele. Let me first clarify that I do like this album a lot, but this is where we start to see Virgin Steele go downhill, mainly David Defeis, as he pretty much is the band at this point. Ever since Noble Savage he has always wrote and produced every album from Virgin Steele. He pretty much did everything himself. But this modern age of the band is when we see David Defeis become a little, let's just say, nuts. He makes a lot of decisions with these modern albums that I and most other fans cannot stand and defend. These decisions would go on full force in albums later down the road. since Visions of Eden would only start to show signs of what was to come. The first issue that starts to arise is David Defeis' voice. At this point it is not as strong as it once was, and you can tell his voice is deteriorating. It's not bad on Visions of Eden, but you can clearly see a decline, which gets me wondering, how did this happen? Because 4 years earlier he sounded great in the Book of Burning, and if you look up this live show in 2004 he sounds just fine, so how did his voice decline so quickly? I've seen some theories state that he had some disease back in 2005, which does make the most sense, but I haven't seen any evidence backing this up, so the cause of his voice deterioration is unknown. Now old age happens. A lot of metal singers' voices get worse as they get older. It's something I can totally understand and respect. But the problem with David Defeis is that he tries using auto-tune to make his voice sound better. Now I absolutely hate auto-tune. Ozzy Osbourne did it, which made me pissed. But how David Defeis uses auto-tune absolutely frustrates me. It doesn't sound bad on Visions of Eden, only albums later down the road. But you can hear that something is off with his voice, not because of old age, but the auto-tune. Another thing that crosses the line with me is that David Defeis doesn't even use the drummer Frank Gilchrist anymore. He wasn't kicked from the band and he still plays on tours. But every album from this point onwards David Defeis uses a drum machine. Another thing that I absolutely hate, just look at Judas Priest's Ram It Down, which has overproduced drums all over the place. But I still like almost every song. I just don't listen to this one as much as the others because of the little issues I have, plus the auto-tuned vocals and drum machine. Some songs I really like would include Bone Dust, Child Slayer, Angel of Death, and I really like When Dusk Fell, which is my favorite ballad off this album. It has a really cool atmosphere. In fact, the atmosphere of Visions of Eden is pretty cool, different from their other albums. My favorite song off this album would have to be The Ineffable Name, the fastest and heaviest song off the album, and I find it to be a killer song. I do like Visions of Eden a lot despite its issues, and I think it's a unique album from their discography. Sadly, it gets worse from here. This is where it really starts to go downhill. I find the Black Light Bacchanalia to be very mediocre. It's pretty much Visions of Eden but a lot more boring. It is heavier and darker, but I don't think the songwriting is that much memorable. Now the auto-tuned vocals is definitely presenting itself more, but I still think it sounds fine, and you can clearly hear the drum machine. But my biggest issue with this album is songwriting, which is something I don't want to say because I consider David Defeis to be a master at songwriting, but I was pretty underwhelmed when listening to this the first time. The issue with the songwriting is that there are many songs that are way too long, that are just the same tempo, chord progressions, and melodies that don't reach me that much. There's an 11-minute song on here called To Crown Them with Halos, and the whole song is just generic chord progressions with no tempo changes or interesting riffs. I don't think any of this music is bad. It is likable, but I just find it mediocre at best. There are two songs I really love on here though, both of them being long epics. I really like Necropolis. He answers them with death. It has a powerful chorus, and has interesting sections in the middle. A really good song that shows what this album could have been.
He answers them with death. He answers them with death. All those songs, he answers them.
My favorite song on here has to be the epic opener, by the Hammer of Zeus and the Wrecking Ball of Thor. Honestly, it's one of their best songs. It's epic, heavy, powerful, and anthemic. Just like most other Virgin Steele songs, this song is probably my favorite one from this modern era.
By the hammer of Zeus and the wrecking ball of Thor.
Even though those two songs are amazing, it still doesn't make this album groundbreaking for me, but this album is miles better than what was about to come. Brace yourselves, lads. Oh, my loving God. This album. Now let me start off by saying, the following criticism is not intended to attack, insult, nor make fun of Virgin Steele in any means. I am just pointing out major issues with the music that me and most fans have problems with. I'm mainly pointing this out because allegedly David Defeis or someone else affiliated with Virgin Steele tried to copyright strike Downfall Network's video on this band. Obviously for reasons relating to criticism, and I don't want to fall victim to this as well. Now moving on to Nocturnes of Hellfire and Damnation. I simply cannot get into this album. In fact, I find it to be almost unlistenable. The main reason being, remember when I was talking about David Defeis using auto-tune? Well, this album has the most unbearable, cringy, and over-the-top auto-tune effects I have ever heard. Like, I am absolutely baffled. The auto-tune sounds so terrible and irritating, nails on a chalkboard levels bad. I don't know how this album got signed and released. The auto-tune effects range from heavily distorted vocals to high-pitched squeaks that actually hurt my fucking ears. It's absolutely unlistenable. Like, I get it, David Defeis has lost his once glorious and powerful voice due to old age. Like, look at this live clip from 2010. But that absolutely does not mean you have to alter your voice with a computer to make it sound good again. I would much rather hear you attempt to sing right now than this auto-tune mess. What really frustrates me is that David Defeis thinks it sounds great. In fact, this interview sums up his mindset perfectly during this time.
On one of the rare occasions, I am pretty happy. Probably on that record, I'm the most happy with how it turned out. Normally, I'm like, oh no, I need more time, it's not right, whatever. On every record, it's the same, even that one. But it's the closest to what it sounds like in my head, actually how it came out on tape.
Wait, what? So you're telling me that this sounds better than this? This cannot be the same person who wrote and produced the brilliant Marriage of Heaven and Hell albums. This is absolutely crazy.
Some people complain about a snare drum sound or whatever, and that's all bullshit. You know, at the end of the day, it's like, do you have the songs? I listen to records, people say it's the most amazing thing in the world. And maybe sonically it's very good, but it has no content. It sounds like complete shit to me. This is me personally. I don't give a shit about that. I listen to records like these old blues records that recorded on somebody's porch with one microphone. And who gives a shit? It's the emotion that comes through. That's what you try to do. It's the song that matters, and it's the emotion that you're trying to capture with a thing.
I get what he's trying to say here. The music is what really matters at the end of the day. In fact, I do think that the musical idea of Nocturnes is pretty cool. But if the record's production sounds like complete shit, then it just ruins the music for me. Take Death Magnetic from Metallica as an example. An album that has good music but is ruined by irate loudness or production, which makes me not want to listen to it as much. Same thing for Nocturnes. But this time the vocal effects make this album nearly unlistenable. So I agree production isn't a major factor in what makes a record good, but it's important that it doesn't sound terrible so that it won't ruin the main idea and atmosphere of the record. You can't say production doesn't matter. What David Defeis really needs is his own producer, someone who can tell him no. This idea sucks. David Defeis can still compose music all he wants, but it's important that the end result sounds at least listenable. If I was his producer, I would tell him, the bad auto-tune and drum machine effects needs to go. Either you try to sing now, get a new singer, or go instrumental. Virgin Steele is still completely capable of writing badass music, but you can't do that with these horrible producing ideas. Sadly, even if David Defeis is watching this, he won't even bother to change.
If nobody likes it, I don't care. This is who I am right now. This is what I'm feeling.
Oh well, may Virgin Steele rest in peace. Now, is there anything I like about Nocturnes of Hellfire and Damnation? It does have some cool riffs and melodies, and some songs have pretty cool ideas. My favorite song would be Persephone. I like the idea of this song, but it was still executed horribly with the auto-tune and drum machine effects. I have nothing more to say about this god-awful garbage. I can't believe my favorite band was capable of making something this bad. Now moving on to their latest album. Now it starts to get weird. Once you start looking into this album, you will be absolutely confused. Seven Devils Moonshine is actually the name of a box set, containing 5 different albums. Just letting you know, only one of these albums actually contains new material. 2 of the LPs are Hymns to Victory and the Book of Burning, and the remaining 3 is what David Defeis advertises to be 3 whole new albums. But once you actually look into these albums, you would find out that they contain a lot of cover songs, some redone songs from the past, and new material. What makes this annoying is that David Defeis advertised it as 3 whole new albums containing new material, when only one of the albums actually contains new material. And also, the only way you buy this album is by buying the box set, so you would have a lot of useless material if you were only buying it for the new songs. What a ripoff. And it gets even dumber. When you look at the track listing for the 3 albums, the new material, cover songs, and redone songs are all scrambled. It's not even organized. I had to spend a decent amount of time plucking out the new songs from these albums. I have already made a playlist in the description with all of the new material, but I'll still explain what's in the LPs. Ghost Harvest Vintage 1 Black Wine for Morning mostly contains the new album, but there are a few covers and redones you have to take out. Ghost Harvest Vintage 2 Red Wine for Warning is basically all covers and redones, but there are some interlude tracks and the song The Triple Goddess which are new, and then Gothic Voodoo Anthems you can just ignore since it's all cover songs and redone songs. Well, that was a mess. But what do I actually think of the new material? I find it to just be okay. It's very experimental, and Virgin Steele completely ditched any elements of power metal, instead going for a total blues fusion with classical music. It's actually a pretty cool idea, but then just like the last album, it's filled to the brim with horrible auto-tune and production. But I would say it's more tolerable and less over the top than Nocturnes. But I still almost never listen to this album. There are a few songs I quite like, and some that are just really weird and stupid. I quite like songs like 7 Dead Within, Hearts on Fire, and my favorite song would have to be Green Dusk Blues. It has some cool riffs, and has some very awesome soloing from Edward Persino. The Ghost Harvest album definitely has some potential, but because of these issues that David Defeis refuses to fix because of his perfectionist ego is the reason why this and Nocturnes of Hellfire and Damnation are not good albums. And with that, we finally finished Virgin Steele's discography. I did hear rumors about new albums from them, but Virgin Steele has been pretty silent since the pandemic started. This video is already long as hell, but Virgin Steele is my favorite band and I had to make a video on them at some point. And also, since this video wasn't a discography ranking unlike my other videos, I'll do a quick ranking of the Virgin Steele albums just for more info on how I perceive these records. And now this monster of a video is finally complete. As you have seen many times in this video, I absolutely adore this band, even when the two latest albums exist. Those don't stop me from declaring Virgin Steele to be my favorite band. And the saddest thing about Virgin Steele is how underground they are. Barely anybody knows this band, and only a handful of people are dedicated fans like me. I made this video to expose more people in the metal community to this band, and I sincerely hope this works. These guys are the prime example of perfect US power metal, and they absolutely deserve more recognition, at least as much as Manowar. If I introduced you to your new favorite band, you're welcome. Thanks for watching.
Let no man make laws for me.